That was fun.
That was fun.
That was fun to do, yeah. That was fun. That was fun. A lot of work with the makeup, but that was fun. 6 to 8 hours of makeup. That was amazing, though, because each little piece they put on was like 168 pieces, Sissy.
And he drove you crazy?
No, well, I finally got a little used to it, and they narrowed it down to like 5.5. But when you would look in the mirror, if you like it was, I couldn't tell. It looked like which made it so much easier to play the thing because it was so. The special effects people in that film.
They're masterful. I know.
Unreal.
Yeah.
Unreal how they did that.
It's incredible what
and
they do.
And every day,
right?
brand new mask. All 67 pieces, and they would come and put each piece back on. Amazing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the debut episode of $1 Million Day Player. This is it's an appreciation podcast for Peter Greene. It's only going to be about 6 or 7 episodes, but they're going to be 6 or 7 really great episodes. In each episode, I'm going to have a different co-host with me to discuss a film, one of my favorite films of Peter's that I want to discuss, I guess. And on my first episode, I have the lovely Quatoyiah Murry. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I feel like we should talk about the technical difficulties we've had, but I feel like it would set us up really badly for the audience. Like, I'm a little embarrassed.
I'm a little embarrassed myself, but yeah, I guess to sum it up, it took us a good 43 minutes to get this call going.
Yeah, it seemed like it was going to be so simple, and it was not.
I blame the technology and not us. I really think that it was a lot of things conspiring against us, honestly.
It really was. Like, there was a force in this universe that did not want us to talk about this movie. And actually the movie that we were discussing on the first episode is The Mask. And I wasn't super sure where The Mask was going to fall in the sort of episode list of this podcast, like what episode it was going to be, but it kind of feels the most appropriate to make it the first episode because this was my introduction to Peter's work. I was around 7 or 8 or so when I saw The Mask for the first time. Was that about your age or?
I believe so. Yeah, it had to be around the same time. I'm pretty sure I saw it on video. I don't remember seeing it in the movie theater. But yeah, it was one of those movies I saw an obscene amount of times, that to the point that I have a very complicated memory of of what I feel about this movie. It's very love-hate for sure.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. Now, when I did bring up the idea of doing the podcast to you, I think I presented you with 2 movies. I think it was like it was Clean Shaven and The Mask, and you had such a strong reaction to The Mask. I was like, we have to do The Mask because.
I have a very, very strong reaction for that movie.
Yeah, well, the reason I guess part of the reason for the reaction, I guess the other part is what you just mentioned earlier, but part of the reasoning was, I guess, Peter Greene's character scared you, and I never really asked you to clarify whether it was like while he was in The Mask or just like the character of Dorian Tyrell was scary to you.
So for me, it was the character himself, but it stems from a very personal, I remember having a dream about The Mask when I was a kid. And it was one of those dreams that you kind of never forget, like when you're a child, you have these weird dreams that just for some reason sticks with you. And for some reason, I remember having a dream somewhere in elementary school about The Mask. And in my dream, I saw the movie as a horror film almost. So It was, and he was the villain, of course, but he absolutely horrified me. And it was just him as a character. And so while I was rewatching the movie to get ready to talk about this, certain scenes were just kind of like almost triggering of like, oh yeah, I forgot that really scared the shit out of me. And I don't know why, it's just these really weird moments, but he's sitting on the desk, almost like his introduction of a character. And he's talking about doing work behind the boss's back, and he has the cigarette and he burns the holes in the eyes of the boss of the picture that he's holding.
Yes.
And just something that was so evil and like demented to me as a child. And I was just like, who is this creepy man? And so in my dream, the one thing that always stuck out to me was the scene, and I misremembered it in my memory, but the scene where he has the bosses getting on to him, and he puts the birdie in his mouth and he hits the golf ball off of his mouth.
Yes.
So in my dream, it was Peter Greene's character doing that, and at least that's the way I remember the dream. And so that was just always such a frightening moment to me anyway, of like, who would do that? And so as I was watching the movie, I kind of realized, just as the movie works in a kind of noir aspect anyway, it's these very dark, they do a great job of making him a villain with these, dark shadows, and they light him a certain way. And then it was a hodgepodge of him in other films, and I had completely forgotten about his character in Pulp Fiction. And so in the movie I was like, oh yeah, he terrified me in Pulp Fiction too. And it's just, he became this like all-encompassing, like terrible human being to me, and that's the only way I've remembered him. So when you mentioned him, I was like, Peter Greene, who is that? And when I looked him up, I was like, oh, that fucker. And immediately I was like, this guy. So I was very interested to talk about it and get your perspective of who he is and why you like him and all of that.
That's so interesting. So I want to go back to a couple of things you said, because the golf tee in the mouth thing, I thought that maybe since I was older and I was watching it, because I hadn't watched The Mask in probably like 15 or 20 years until I watched it recently. And as a kid, that scene always bothered me, like with when he puts the golf thing in Peter's mouth and he hits the golf ball off of it, and I always thought that was such a weird, misplaced scene in a PG-13 film. It is so disturbing to watch that scene happen. And even though Dorian is essentially like the main antagonist, like just seeing his boss get introduced in such a brutal way, when 5 minutes before you were watching Jim Carrey bounce up and down and like hit a cartoon clock and all this stuff. It's so weird. And actually, like, going back and rewatching it, like, first of all, that movie's just fucking bonkers. Like, it is
wild. It's absolutely wild.
It's so energetic. Like, I was exhausted, like, around the time he got the mask, I was like, okay, I'm already tired. But there's this weird kind of tonal difference in between like all of Jim's scenes and all of Peter's scenes. And it works really well. But if you were just to like, kind of cut all of Peter's scenes out, and you just played them all sort of in a row, and Jim wasn't in any of them, like, you would never really, I guess, connect that it was The Mask if you weren't super familiar with the movie and you knew the scenes and whatnot.
Exactly.
It gets really dark, and I kind of applaud them for them making Dorian like an actual villain. Like he doesn't drop a whole lot of swear words because it's a PG-13 film, but like he's genuinely, he's not incompetent, he's not like silly, he's not he's not a goofball. He's like an actual antagonist. Like, he's scary. And I mean, just looking at the other two Jim Carrey films that came out that year, because like Dumb and Dumber and The Mask and Ace Ventura all came out in 1994. Like,
wow.
I don't know how that happened, but I checked IMDb and they all came out in 1994. And so and I mean, I guess the ratings on those could be a little bit lower, but in all of those, like, the antagonists are sort of like silly and incompetent, and you're not super threatened by the main baddie that is up against Jim's character. And so like The Mask is such a unique movie to me because like Dorian's scary as fuck. And I mean, but I did have like a very confusing crush on Dorian. Like it was a very confusing time for me. I
And I
know.
get it. He's kind of hot. Like rewatching it, I was like, oh, well, had I just seen this from maybe Cameron Diaz's character perspective of like, oh, well, he's kind of hot. Yeah, I would steal money for him. Like I'd do that. But it's just having that as a kid seeing it. And then as you mentioned, I mean, it's such a bonkers movie. That's why I have a very love-hate relationship with it, because I remember it was one of those movies that I think we just rented a lot. So I watched it within a short period of time a lot. So I went through multiple stages of, thinking, oh, this is funny and goofy and Jim Carrey is so great and silly, to just, all right, this is fucking weird. This is getting on my nerves. This is obnoxious. He's doing too much, to just being like, oh my God, why is that guy now so creepy to me? I don't know what it was, or maybe it was backwards of how that went, but there was just a lot of emotion that I like just never, and I was actually kind of like, oh man, I got to go back and rewatch The Mask. Like shit, I was kind of upset about it, but it was good to rewatch it, because it reminds me of just that really odd time in the early '90s where Hollywood was obsessed with classics again, with classic film. And as somebody that works in classic film, it's nice to see that. And I kind of missed that period where like, oh yeah, well, I don't know what was happening at that time, but there's, with Dick Tracy and all of this, like the 1940s and the 30s were becoming, it was hip to be into classics again. And so much of The Mask is, WB property. So it's all the Looney Tunes, but then there's, noir influences and classic movie influences thrown around and stuff like that. So it was very interesting.
That's really funny that you say that, because as I was rewatching it, and I think it's because I'm older and I sort of got to watch it with a more matured, sort of critical eye. And I was thinking like how there's a lot of shots in The Mask that sort of look like they look like early 90s like comic book movies. Like
yeah
Edge City kind of looks like Gotham in a way, and
exactly, it does. Yeah.
And there's a lot of architecture and a lot of like color palettes that really sort of brought back like those early 90s Batman films. And a lot of the elements also sort of contributed to that. Like I noticed again for the first time, just because I'm older and I'm sort of watching with a more matured sort of critical view, is like no one really reacts to shit that happens in the movie. Like like no one, yeah, like they react sort of in a mildly amused type way. Like when Jim Carrey has the mask on and he's like, just making guns out of nothing and creating like carnival spaces and making cops do the, dance. Like no one really reacts. Like it's all just kind of in this weird kind of accepted surrealness of the world, I guess.
Exactly, which is so odd because there's the scene that kind of encompasses that perfectly to me is when he, as the Mask, he's trying to make out, like force himself on Cameron Diaz's character in the park, and the cops come and they're like, freeze, and he does that freeze midair and they're like, put your hands up, and he's like, but you told me to freeze. And I was like, no one is amazed by what the fuck is happening right now. They're just like, this guy, and it's like nowhere else in this world does that zaniness exist, and yet they're just like, he's just wearing a mask being a silly old dude. And it's like, wait, what world do y'all live in? How is this acceptable?
Right, yeah. Yeah, it was super odd. And that's exactly, I think that was the exact scene that I sort of, because I was taking notes as I was watching, and that was the exact scene. I was like, wait, he just turned into a frozen sculpture and no one has made a comment. They're just like, oh, this guy, like this wackadoodle, this
wacky dude. Yeah, and it's just like, wait, like I get if there's just, weird stuff happening on the streets all the time, but there's not. This is a very sane, normal world where the only weird thing is now this green-faced guy who's like, it's a very odd movie for sure.
It is. And then like combined with all the very grounded, sort of disturbing imagery in it. Like, there's a couple of times where there's like guns pointed at people's heads, and there's no like major blood or any, well, I guess except for like when Dorian's like his right hand man dies, like during the bank robbery, there's some blood there, but for the most part there's no like real like crazy amounts of blood or crazy amounts of like realistic violence. It's just the small amounts of violence that we do get, they just look like they're out of a Quentin Tarantino film. They're just
exactly, and it's pretty shocking. And that like the part where he's and I think that also as a kid, this may be why I kind of associated horror aspects to it. The part where he's doing the balloon animals in the alley, and that kind of reminds me of Killer Clowns from Outer Space, where they're doing the shadow puppets. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's this. Are you familiar with that movie?
I've heard of it, but I've never actually seen it.
Okay, very silly, but I saw it as a kid, and it's, these, as the title tells you, they're killer clowns from outer space. So there's a scene where these giant clowns are doing shadow puppets on the wall, and there's a group of spectators, and they're like, so impressed by these shadow puppets, and one of the shadow puppets turns to a monster and then eats these people on the streets, which was terrifying to me as a kid. So, when they show Jim Carrey, doing the balloon animals in the alley, I think like I weirdly associated those two. And then of course he brings out a Tommy gun and then starts shooting at them, and I'm just like, what is this movie? What was I watching as a kid? There's just, as you said, there's just a lot of violence, even though no one gets killed, oddly enough, except the black man. And I hate throwing out stuff like that, but he's the only character that I can think of that actually dies.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Yeah,
which is pretty messed up. But yeah, like there's no blood or guts or anything anywhere, but there is a lot of violence. And even the landlord, when he first has his thing as the mask, and she, brings out a shotgun and is shooting like holes in the ground and shooting at the shotgun. So it's just this very, like kid, like that was just so odd to me. Also, was like and I guess in their defense, that's what the WB, the Looney Tune cartoons were doing. Elmer Fudd had a shotgun blowing Daffy Duck's beak behind his face. Right. So I guess that's kind of the world that they're trying to establish here, but it's just live action. It feels weirder to me. Yeah, same here. And I just, as weird as it sounds, like as you were saying that, I just sort of made the connection that they are setting up this very cartoonish, like straight from the cartoons, not just the sense that like a bunch of wacky things happen, but there is a very specific style that they are bringing in to the film, and they do that, also with the fact that Jim Carrey's character seems to like those types of cartoons, like he. Exactly. He's shown watching them and sort of, so that kind of brings that into it as well. Like I was a little weirded out by going back and watching this movie, because I don't have any bad memories of this movie. Of course, I absolutely love this movie, but when you see something at 8 or 9 years old and you haven't really seen it since, like I was afraid it would lose the magic that I was left with when I saw it, that it wouldn't hold up, being in my 30s now, it wouldn't hold up, and I wouldn't really be able to giggle at all the stuff that I had giggled at before, or maybe like I would, watch it and realize that there were so many plot holes, and I just, couldn't forgive the plot holes and whatnot. But for me personally, it's super held up. Like it surprisingly does. For as weird and offbeat as it is, it's surprisingly, like, the plot is not completely ridiculous once you accept, all right, with this mask on, all these wacky things happen and it's accepted, whatever. There's moments that are actually pretty funny that I did, like I was watching it at work, just kind of at my desk, that I like giggled out loud at, and little stuff like that. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that also made me laugh when I was 8 too. So it surprisingly holds up well.
Yeah, it was strange, but I may have to like go buy it on DVD now, because it does hold up super well. So I do want to talk a bit more about Peter's performance in here, because I think well, because the podcast is about him, but also, I think he pulled off a very unique thing, which is he was, as we were discussing earlier, like Dorian is like a very serious villain. Like he's not over the top or kind of silly, or he's intimidating for sure. But there are parts where I could tell that Peter was definitely reined in a little bit. Because it is a PG-13 movie, he can't be too intimidating, because I've seen him in like R-rated stuff, and he can be a scary dude if you need him to be a scary dude, but I think they do break that up a little bit by giving him sort of very PG-13 lines to say sometimes. Like he says something about like icing someone, which is not a phrase that is said in anything that's rated over PG-13.
Yeah.
And also there's a couple of chances where he sort of gets to be silly, and the scene I'm thinking about in particular is the scene where Jim Carrey is doing his best Sally Field impression.
I love that scene. Yeah.
Such a great scene. And like it didn't really, I don't think it impressed me as much when I was a kid, but as I was rewatching it, like just watching Peter sort of react to, because the character can see the audience as well, and like he's like straightening his hair, and he's kind of like he's caught off guard, like someone has just like put a camera on him suddenly, and there's like he's so subtle in the scenes where he does have to kind of play into the silliness of the world, and he can't be like super intimidating Dorian Tyrell. He kind of has to be on Jim Carrey's field a little bit, but I thought he did such a great job of sort of remaining sort of scary, but still remembering like the movie that he was in. Yeah,
exactly. And he surprisingly he does a lot where he's not just this kind of one note evil guy for the sake of being evil type of thing, and as much as it definitely was I noticed, of course, when the black character dies, but it was a very tender scene that he was able to like play up of just, this is his friend. His friend was shot in the line of duty almost. And, he brings him the cigarette, and just his face once he puts the cigarette to his friend's lip and realizes that his friend is dead. There's like, they give him this, or he brings to this character almost this kind of communal aspect of, all right, he messed with my boys, now I gotta kill him, now I have to go after this green bastard, like he brings a slight tenderness there that as a kid, of course, I not at all remember. In my mind, he was just this evil, scary dude. And of course, once he gets the mask and what he turns into, but I liked the more human aspect, and how this is just, a little small town thug wanting to break his way up to the top and get what's owed to him and his guys. I really liked that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, and that was definitely, and I had that moment actually noted in my notes when his homeboy dies, and they keep the camera on Peter's face as it's happening, which I thought was like really important, because it they don't get a whole lot of time on screen together to sort of establish that, and so I thought it was very important for them to keep the camera on Peter's face, and so we could watch him react to his friend dying, and so that we could sort of be like, okay, like we understand Jim has the mask on and he can't like control his urges, but he's about to die now. Like this is this is it. Exactly. So I want to talk a little bit about actually Peter in the mask. Like Peter, I don't know who in the world hasn't seen this movie. I feel like I should do a quick synopsis of it. Fucking 20 minutes in. But The Mask is essentially a movie about a loser guy named Stanley Ipkiss, and the movie makes sure that that he is a loser and that he's very nice and he's too nice. And he can't really stand up to his asshole boss, and he, kind of gets walked on by the woman he has a thing for at his job. But he finds this mythical mask floating in the river one night, and it sort of brings out all these really deep urges and desires in him that have been sort of pushed down by all of his, sort of passiveness and whatnot. And so while he has this mask on, he kind of turns into this bizarre, crazy person. And his craziness sort of interferes with the sort of, like you said, small town thug of his city, and he ends up sort of interfering with some of the operations they have going on, and then he's forced to kind of try and get his way out of that. But in the process, the bad guy, Dorian Tyrell, the thug who's played by Peter, he gets his hands on the mask, and I thought the way that they sort of changed the mask's appearance when it was on Dorian, just because Dorian was not this, didn't have the personality that Stanley did. He wasn't as nice and much of a pushover. He had sort of like a more evil energy to him, and so it fit on his face very differently, and like the black storm clouds like happen the first time he puts it on. And whatnot. And I mean, if you think he's scary just as himself in the mask, holy shit.
Exactly.
He is.
Yeah, he just keeps up. He becomes like a Lou Ferrigno type character. He's basically like a Hulk. He's just this gigantic beast of a man. And it's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, if anything scared me as a kid, I think it would have been while he was in the mask. Like, that was when I was like, okay, I don't know what happened to the hot guy that was playing Dorian, but this is not what I signed up for. But yeah, so he doesn't have it on for very long. But for the scenes that he does have it on for, he's completely effective. And I think that's, he very effectively sells the reason why Jim Carrey like completely chucks the mask at the end of the movie. He's like, nope.
We don't need this thing floating around anymore.
Right. Like that.
Yeah.
Don't need that. But yeah, like it, and again, some more disturbing imagery. Near the end of the movie, where they're at the charity ball and everything, and Dorian has the mask, and he's gonna blow the whole thing up. So his boss that fucking hit the golf off of his mouth, golf ball off of his mouth earlier. He's at this charity ball, and he pumps Dorian while he's in this mask full of bullets, and Dorian like fucking sucks up the bullets and shoots them back out of his mouth. And if Jim Carrey had been doing it, it would have been kind of like a silly gag, but that's horrifying. Like, just
it's terrifying. Yeah.
It's, again, and I think even though there are like some sort of cartoonish elements to it, I think it's still one of the more disturbing sort of images. And he kills Nico. I think his boss's name was Nico, and so he kills him, and there's no blood and whatnot, but he gets blown back a few feet, and and like that's clearly a death that has just happened, and it is really, really unnerving to watch.
Exactly. Yeah. And I like, again, that when the deaths do happen, they're always around Peter Greene's character. They don't really happen in any other way, because there's even a super silly part where as Stanley, Jim Carrey's character, is trying to run away from the cops who are after him, and there's this reporter who's like, oh, get in my car, so she ends up taking him away, and the cops are just pumping bullets into this car, but they're all bouncing off in this little kind of cartoonish way, and then once they drive off, a character says, oh, we missed, and then like the detective just kind of looks at him and is like, come on, like, and then they just kind of run off. So it's, and I like that they reserve all these death moments or these really gruesome moments for when Peter Greene is in a scene, and I think that just kind of heightens, the fear of this character and his and. What so as you know his career a lot better, is just playing creepy dudes his thing?
He gets cast as creepy dudes a lot.
Okay.
I think his roles in films like Pulp Fiction and The Usual Suspects, which I will also be discussing on this podcast, I think that sort of it played him up so much into like a particular sort of type that like a lot of directors just sort of they sort of just follow suit. And I think when they hire him, they go, oh, we want that version of Peter Greene, we want the one that we saw in The Usual Suspects. And the reason I'm doing this podcast is because he's such a versatile actor. And actually the other film that I mentioned to you, Clean Shaven, is a little indie film that he did back in 93. Gosh, this is only a year between Clean Shaven and The Mask.
Wow.
But it's a true drama. Like it's a character study, like a slice of life type film. And I actually said in the episode 0 of this podcast, I think if Clean Shaven had the impact on his career that Pulp Fiction or The Usual Suspects would have had, I think Peter would have been in a lot more like straight dramas. I think he would have done like a lot of what he's done in his career, like a lot of kind of kingpins and thugs and stuff. But I honestly think that he would have had more shots in like indie drama, like heavy, kind of emotionally disturbing dramas. And and I saw an interview with him where he did express interest in doing more films like that. And I mean, he wasn't complaining about his career trajectory, that's happening now, but I think he does have a real desire to do sort of those more deeply emotional, kind of taxing, or those just deeply emotional stories that really rely on like just a really kind of heavy emotional message.
Yeah, because that and I that sucks that he has been typecast for so long, just because I don't know any of his work outside of him playing these type of not great dramatic, because he has the face for it. He can do those characters really well. But I know as an actor, that's got to be frustrating, because all you want to do is just show your range. And, it's more fun and compelling to do something that's different rather than, hold a gun at somebody or, kind of play the same old thing over and over again. So I'm interested to see Clean Shaven. While you were talking about it, I was just kind of Googling some of the images, and it looks pretty compelling. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it actually, I just got it on the Criterion Collection DVD. So it's good if it made Criterion Collection.
That's true. Yeah.
And it looks amazing. I saw this film like when I was very young, probably a little too young to be watching it. But and I think I want to say I ordered it from Netflix, like when they had first kind of started out, and you had to like
the good old days with the disc. Yeah,
the good old days. And like whatever copy they had of it, it just looked like ass. And so when I got my Criterion Collection version of it, I popped it in, I was like, this is amazing. They did such a great job on remastering it and just making it look crisp and beautiful, and it looks awesome. And I totally support you going to watch that film, because I honestly think it will change your, and I know you don't have like a bad perspective on Peter or anything. I think it'll just widen like your opinions of his abilities and whatnot, which is the whole purpose of this podcast. I love how we've come full circle.
We did, yeah.
But yeah, I think that covers The Mask. Like it's not a particularly deep movie.
Not at
It's
I love to try to find hidden meaning and stuff. There's no hidden meaning in this. It is what it is.
right. It is.
Yeah.
That's so true. It is very just what it is. There's no kind of hidden meaning, as you said. But it's still a great movie. I suggest if you haven't seen The Mask in a while, or maybe you saw The Mask and you didn't quite absorb Peter's performance the way that we have, I definitely suggest going back to watch it. It's a fun movie, and it is a movie that is kept relatively grounded by Peter's performance, because it's so intense in relation to the rest of the movie, and it creates this very yin and yang sort of effect to the emotional kind of range of it. So
exactly, yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of the podcast, Quatoyiah.
Yay! Thank you for reaching out. I'm glad I got to rewatch The Mask, and I'm glad that now my world of Peter Greene is open. I'm very excited.
Yes, that's that's the podcast. We're gonna end it right here. The first episode is the last episode. No, I'm just kidding. No.
I did what I had to do. I'm done.
Yeah, like my mission is accomplished. Going home. No, it makes me very happy to hear you say that, and I hope to do that for more people with this podcast.
Yay.
So yeah, all right. Hi, Amanda here. Thank you so much for listening to the very first episode of $1 Million Day Player. If you couldn't tell, Quatoyiah and I had such a blast recording that episode. It was so much fun. But because it is a new podcast, still trying to figure out what the format is going to be, and I forgot to mention a couple of things. The clip used at the top of the episode was of Peter on the Sissy Gamache show. I really hope I didn't totally butcher her name. She's been so awesome to me in the process of getting this podcast together, and so gracious. I wrote her asking her if I could use a few clips from the interviews that she's done with Peter over the years, and she has been so awesome about letting me use whatever I want. And I'm going to actually link to the interview that clip is from in the show notes. Also, my co-host Quatoyiah is amazing and so insightful, and she's amazing and insightful for a living, with classic film. She has a Twitter that you're definitely going to want to follow her at. It's at Toya M. That's TOYIAHM, and I'll link to that in the show notes. She also has a website where she writes film critiques. It's called the cinephiliac.com. I will link to that in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and it's only going to get more awesome from here, so stay tuned. Super last minute update. I am literally about to publish the episode, but I had to make a correction. It is Sissy Gamache. So I pronounced poor Sissy's name wrong for at least 2 episodes here, and I won't be able to go in and correct those pronunciations of it, but I can correct this one. So I'm so sorry, Sissy. Please forgive me.